All of these challenges are interdisciplinary, and the solutions, though, have to be intergenerational. Young people sort of figured out the math. You're going to need many ways to do this. And so I think it's smarter to already engage the next generation or multiple generations in some of these approaches to the transition so that we don't go one step forward, two step back, or have the politics catch us blindside us.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome back to Commodities in Asia on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Lee Howell, Executive Director at the Villars Institute. We'll be discussing the shifting tides in international affairs and the new geopolitical realities that are being created by the energy transition and Asia's place in it. Hello, Lee. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Well, really glad to have you here today. I've been looking forward to this conversation because you've been at the center of the conversations shaping the course of international collaboration for more than a decade, producing the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos and the annual Summer Davos meeting in China, among others. And I've been looking forward to discussing with you these shifting tides in international affairs and geopolitical realities that are being created by the energy transition and Asia's place in it. Maybe we can start with an observation or speculation on my part, which is that it seems we're seeing a shift from a world where international trade's been arranged around World Trade Organization or WTO principles to one where we're seeing the reemergence of industrial policy. We're seeing policies like those in the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and to a lesser extent, the CBAM in Europe, that are picking winners and losers in a way reminiscent, to me at least, of the industrial policy of China and Japan that the US and Europe long opposed. Maybe it's not as simple and tidy as all that, but I was curious for your opinion on, do you see these climate change and energy transition policies shifting the consensus around how international trade should be conducted in the world?
It's a great question, Dave, and a great observation, because I think we are at an inflection point. Most of it, of course, is around the narrative. I think The Economist had an article recently called, the homeland economics of the homeland economy. And, of course, they're arguing their point and what they see in the rise of industrial policy. But here, I'm based in Geneva, and down the road is the World Trade Organization. And the last month at my institute in Villars, we had 100 trade negotiators and experts come and talk about this very issue. And in it, I think, I observed two things. One, a recognition that, the WTO, when it was created through the Marrakesh Agreement in 1994, actually explicitly linked trade to sustainable development. But two, the narrative around sustainable development has changed, as you pointed out. It is not just about the sustainable development goals. We have concerns around everything from, of course, net zero climate change, but even nature loss in terms of, in ways of thinking about biodiversity, right, aligned with climate goals. So I do think we're at a point where trade experts in particular also feel that they are struggling to find relevance, right, in today's sort of political debates. Like, where do they sit? And so that's not a bad time, though, because I think that means people are open to try to rejuvenate the system. And I think the energy transition and, goals linked to climate and to sustainable development are things that I think the trade community, now I'm not talking about the political people, but at least the experts and the negotiators think they get it, that they have to become part of that and part of the solution, not part of the problem when it comes to where we want to go with the global economy in terms of reducing carbon emissions and again, preventing biodiversity loss, et cetera. So I think they're up for that. The problem is that, all politics is local and the local narratives, change. I do think, though, there are, national politics in some quarters are finding a way to still address climate, and in a way with probably big carrots, like you just mentioned, the IRA, in the United States. Maybe some parts of the world, jurisdictions are favoring a bit more of the big stick. Recently we had, of course, in the EU at least, Switzerland's not part of the EU, but in the region, the discussion about, right, what the double materiality piece about companies having to really list much more in terms of what their impact is on the environment. So, yeah, I think it's still open. I wouldn't call it either way yet. I do think that there are competing narratives. And again, I'll go back to the economists talking about it's all about, the homeland now. You're going to see others speak about it's all about the energy transition and how do we facilitate and enable that. And others will say, well, this is all got to, preserve and protect the planet. So how's that going to work out? How are we going to have prosperity within planetary boundaries? They're all competing, but that's at the multilateral level, I think, in some ways, because I think nationally, each country is just doing its thing. And some of it is surprising, like what happened in the US, as you described. Recently, closer to where I am in the UK, people are a bit more than disappointed, I think, with the direction of the UK government when it comes to their climate policies and what's happening on energy. So, yeah, I do think it's too early to call. And we'll see more people sort of really, trying to capture the hearts and minds of those who make the decisions when it comes to trade.
And when it comes to this question of countries increasingly going their own way, doing their own thing, following their own priorities, one thing it brings to mind is, of course, in the energy transition, there's going to be new industries. Industries will rise, industries will fall. We hear so much conversation around hydrogen, liquefied natural gas, coal. Where do we need more of? What do we need less of? And, to what extent do you see governments around the world getting engaged in the business of trying to pick the winners and losers and making big bets on certain industries?
Well, I think the biggest bets so far have been in electrification, particularly the notion that battery technology is is critical, right, in terms of the future of mobility, and B, it's also critical for the future of renewables in terms of, right, the storage capacity. And in that, you already have, of course, there's one big dominant player in China, of course, and it's able to, produce and manufacture these batteries at, very, very competitive rates, right? And people worrying about them sort of flooding the market, particularly in Europe. U.S., obviously, with IRA and other initiatives, is trying to build that capacity and really trying to friendshore everything, and also, of course, the best of its ability, revisit its capacity to mine and harvest lithium, right? But in Europe, it's tough because there's some stock of lithium discovered in Sweden, but recently there was a great article about they know where there is deposits of lithium in Portugal, but it's really on a very, it's in a rural area where the community is really against it. They don't want to see that strip mining come in. So yeah, I think there's sort of like three perspectives where Chinese said, look, we had the foresight. Why are you so, against us helping you decarbonize and throwing up barriers to our manufacturing of export of batteries for your vehicles in the U.S. or directly to Europeans? Why are you holding us up from exporting low-cost electric vehicles? Right? That's their view, but then that's kind of it's kind of a Brussels, Beijing, Washington debate, right? Because there's other countries on the sidelines that are also still not clear. If you're Japan, in Korea, you made big bets on hydrogen, right? You're still in the battery space. Clearly, they're big players, Panasonic, LGs, and the like. But it's really the big three right now, sort of pulling at this thing. And so I think at the end right now, what's captured most people's attention is the narrative around electrification and EVs and correspondingly batteries and the run for the resources behind those batteries. And it's not just, of course, lithium, cobalt, other precious metals, and also those rare earth metals that are in China, right? So yeah, I think that's where the thing is going to take us, is really quickly into kind of a scrum around, okay, what are we going to do here when it comes to this electrification of everyone's economy?
And the nature of this scrum is really interesting. I love that you brought up the term friendshoring, right? Because we went from a long period of offshoring where it's China's going to be the manufacturer for the world. And now with this list of what technologies are considered critical, what are necessary to feel secure as a nation, it's growing. And suddenly offshoring your technology to be manufactured in China doesn't necessarily seem like the things that politicians in the United States and Brussels, in Washington and Brussels want to do. And I'm curious because we've seen governments becoming more protective of their own technology and more wary of others. You've seen that with Huawei and the US restrictions on semiconductor sales to China. And I'm curious, do you see this mainly as like a US-China shift or a broader shift in how countries are approaching technology?
Yeah, I think it's broader, and it is obviously very difficult if you're Japan or in the Netherlands or anyone else who's in that space where you're talking particularly about a certain class of processors that are particularly, let's say, very important. Initially in gaming and Bitcoin mining and the such, but now of course in AI. Yeah, I think it gets quite complicated because the reality is sort of we're going back to the future because a lot of this is around dual use, the narrative of dual use, right? Which I think many listeners may be too young to remember, but that was a phrase that people lived during the Cold War, and scientists and engineering firms, always were sort of wary of having whatever they're producing or discovering or researching to be considered dual use, because once you have that, you are locked into the sort of military security apparatus of your country, and it's very hard to operate in that kind of an restrictive environment. And also, the worst thing maybe is the chilling effect it would just have on fundamental research, because there's still a lot of that happening, but it does happen. It's even more complicated because some of the best scientists, if you take particle physics, they're Russian, right? And it's hard for Russians to go anywhere and work on these things. And then if not, they're just going to go. It's the Chinese and the Russians. Then is that where we want all sort of an access there when it comes to basic research, and then it's sort of U.S. and Europe and the rest of the world kind of a thing. That's really net not going to be good because obviously we need the best minds to work on these important interdisciplinary problems. But yeah, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think people are already, in a way, it has a chilling effect. There's no rule. There's no really sort of blatant protectionist sort of rules. I mean, there are some. I mean, clearly with some of the new acts in terms of how they've structured the incentives around where you produce and where you don't produce. But yeah, I think people are factoring that. And that said, I also think people are smart enough. Also, we're hearing stories about in the Middle East and others that developing their own chips. There's a lot of interesting things happening, right? Because it is data and the processing power are sort of the real things. The new fossil fuels that will drive replace the fossil fuels that are driving this old economy of the third or fourth industrial revolution, and the next one will be all about the data and processing power, right? So that's where I think things are headed, and it'll be tricky. It'll be tricky, particularly for the smaller countries that are sort of in between, right? Important in the value chain, but not the value chain, if you know what I mean. So they're going to be sort of squeezed on very small things. And I can imagine there's a lot of different small and medium-sized manufacturers that don't really have the capacity or the legal departments to navigate all of this stuff. That's going to be also a big burden on those firms.
Yeah, and this burden, on the one hand, talking about going from kind of a WTO world to more of a industrial policy world sounds very academic, but it has real implications, right? It's about how difficult is it to transact across borders, the burden put on smaller companies. Feels like to some extent we have to kind of go back and dust off a lot of the conversations from 15, 20 years ago and understand those terms. When you brought up dual use, it made me think we had Robert Friedland on the podcast about a month or two ago, and he was bringing up how there's a lot of technology that's been developed on the military side that has very good applications on the civilian side for mining and helping us extract the resources we need. And of course, now there's a lot of technology that's being developed on the civilian side that could fall under a military use. So it starts to get caught under that umbrella. And I'm curious, do we think that obviously throughout history, there's been a lot of conflicts, military conflicts that have arisen over disputes over resources and energy? Is there, how should we be thinking about the military aspect of this changing, international order that we seem to be going through?
Well, I think it's important because obviously our headlines are full of really tragic and alarming developments, right? In Gaza, in the border of Israel, or it could be, Ukraine, Russia, but there are other places that are less known in parts of Africa and such. So we're aware that these are not the best of times when it comes to sort of security and stability. But I would think when it comes to that political military layer of analysis on this, I think you have to look at other domains, because traditionally it has always been about the energy, right? It's been sea lanes, access to the energy and such. I'll take, for example, you mentioned dual use technologies that sort of came out of the military, and that ended up having amazing applications in our sort of daily lives. And of course, the most ones that we're all familiar with is, global positioning systems, GPS. And what happened there, of course, is that the European developed its own platform, the Chinese. But what people aren't appreciating is that if you were to count the number of satellites in the sky today, most of them are privately owned satellites by factor, pretty large factor, right? I think there's less than 1,000 that are really owned by governments, and most of that is military. But there's over 3,000, nearly 5,000. It's growing every day of private sector, small sort of satellites of all shapes and sizes. And of course, the most famous example of this is Starlink, right? And then the revelation in the Walter Isaacson book about the discussion around whether to allow access to those GPS coordinates, allow the Ukrainians to have access to it at a particular point in time, right, in the conflict, right, and kind of the narrative that if they had done so, it would have escalated things, and therefore the decision wasn't with any government or anybody, on the field. It was really a private individual deciding whether to allow the access to the GPS system, right, the satellite system. So yeah, we're in a different world. That wouldn't have been in part of the domain of space has always been very important. I mean, it goes back to Sputnik. And if we could go back into the Cold War kind of timeline, but today, yeah, it's we see it all the time that how important having communications, being able to see things. Geospatial technology, by the way, is also amazing today because of what it can do potentially to save the planet. I mean, how else are we going to measure if people are really capping methane flares from their oil rigs, right? How are we going to actually measure in real time, or as accurately as possible, deforestation in very critical biomes of the world? So the flip side of that is also very important for planetary health, but at the same time, it can be used obviously in ways that we prefer not to see it being used, right, in terms of military advantage in very tense conflicts.
And when you look at, you mentioned we already have a few real wars occurring, actual conflicts, in Ukraine with Russia, in Gaza and Israel. Are there other conflicts that we should be worried about potentially arising as, you mentioned, traditionally conflict over sea lanes, or just as we're changing the nature of where we're getting resources and the technologies? Are there certain flashpoints that you think we need to be aware of?
I do. I mean, I think, go back a step, we talked about the health of the planet. And one of the narratives, of course, is that, if we get past 1.5 and we're on the track for 1.8 degrees warming, nearly 2, then, the massive migration that climate change will produce, right, obviously will exacerbate tensions in various communities. And I think that's still a valid thesis. And, it's not a direct thing. It's a bit indirect, but I could see, because already politically, people are fleeing countries and at a large scale and disturbing the heck out of politics in Europe and the politics in the United States, right? And it's really, we're not even really tying that directly to, there's other things involved that are obviously concerning, in Latin America, the governments there, but also, just the sort of crime and the lack of opportunities. But also, you have people in Europe coming across from Afghanistan, still from Syria and other places, right? Hoping for a better life. So that's already happening. I can imagine if you sort of, literally ratchet up another level with forced migration because you just simply cannot stay in your community because of absolute lack of water or any sort of or you can't grow crops or something, or the heat, just generally just the heat and humidity has got to a point where it's not. Now that's plausible. That's very more than probable. I don't want to call it probable, but we're in that direction. It's probable, right? Then, that's there. But the one I think you're talking about is really all of these things. What bothers us in this is that it's more like, historians still argue, as you know, to this day, about what really triggered and caused the First World War. And it's kind of clear in their minds about the Second World War. But, if there's a third one, would we really know where the flashpoints would be? Would it be, as some would say, some sort of mistake that happened in the South China Sea, but it wasn't, but it involved Filipino Navy and the Chinese Navy, and all of a sudden, because of the security arrangements, the U.S. has to step in and sort of back up Philippines. People aren't aware that there's these institutional relationships that still are around, right? And the one I just mentioned is the U.S. and the Philippines. We're pretty familiar with NATO and in Europe, and people are familiar with the U.S. and South Korea and the U.S. and Japan. But, all of these things are flashpoints. And I think that's the trouble. And also you have sort of very odd actors coming together, right? This is the week, as you all know, the Belt and Road Forum, and you had President Putin arrive in China, which is very rare. But only a month ago, it was very rare to have the head of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, going to Moscow. I mean, these are very different, unexpected travel logs.
It is, and you're making me think, of years ago there was Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And it feels like the world is, I'm not sure what it's becoming, but it seems to be becoming less flat. And I was hoping you might be able to help us understand Asia's role in all of this, because I think it is much bigger than China's role, and countries throughout Asia have different identities and cultures, as well as different political and economic realities. So I was wondering, how do you think about the role that the countries in Asia will play in how the world's organized going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's more than interesting, right? Because just the number of people, and if we were to define Asia as really from Pakistan to Japan, then we're talking, this is just nearly 4 billion people almost, right? And I think, but that said, as you mentioned, the diversity and the historical biases that actually shape a lot of the decisions even today are there. They're not gone. I guess what I would think about is the following. There was the thesis, as you know, that the growth of China would be good for the region. Everybody would supply and would benefit from the Chinese consumer and tourism, and that was very clear. There's been a new sort of reality, though. Some people have been very critical, for example, that the financing capital that went into the Belt Road Initiative. And so that's always, there's always going to be sort of people sort of seeing the upside or downside of this. But I do think what we hadn't contemplated in all of this was a interesting security discussions. I would just say, for example, the notion that India in this new region called the Indo-Pacific, right? Because it's in a way the Asia-Pacific of the traditional Western powers, sort of inviting and including India as a player, as a partner in this Indo-Pacific, in the big maritime forces of the U.S. and Japan and Australia, right? And now with India. That's different. That's new. That's only recently in our vernacular. I wouldn't say it's not something we were talking about 20 years ago. The Taiwan Straits, of course, still very, very important and very key. What we're more concerned about is that in this last several years, the Chinese capabilities in terms of they're able to have aircraft launched from their own carrier groups. That's a big difference. It's not just and the development of Mischief Reef and all that's been there, but now really they are not in many ways. People are concerned because they have the capabilities. They've invested quite a bit in the next generation of military aviation platforms and things. So I think that's also significant. And you also had a turn around in terms of what the Japanese and even the Koreans are capable of sort of working and thinking together, because North Korea is still around, right? So yeah, I think that part of the world has always been a place where at times there's great positive narrative about a trans-Pacific trading area, and indeed thinking about a great value chain that would sort of lift the boats across the region and people out of absolute poverty, and that's still true. But it's always been there's always been also this sort of underlying fragility when it comes to the political military arrangements in the region. And so that's why it's all in a period of transition. And I think, it's interesting how the U.S.'s discussion with Vietnam 20 years ago was more about just opening their markets at that time. And now has a sort of different dimension to it when it comes to collaborating, because they have very important seaports, right? And assets for the U.S. Navy. So it's just, that's kinds of, it's just different conversations. And what I worry the most, Dave, is that we're pretty much at the point where most people have lived through the horrors of in that region, the Korean War or even the Vietnam War, but certainly the Second World War. They're passing on, and that's important, because there's always a kind of a reminder of what's really at stake when you have people with their sort of lived experience tell you that it's not worth it. When those people disappear, you might think, it might be worth, this might be worth the gambit, right? And that's dangerous.
Absolutely. I'm curious because you've been involved in these conversations for so many decades. And I think a lot of the rest of us who aren't as deeply connected, we kind of adopt the shorthands, of offshoring, friendshoring. And I guess what I'm curious about is when you look within the region of Asia, what do you see as some of the big things that the various countries want their place in the world to be. There was a period where it was using the US and European consumer being the manufacturer for those markets. And that was a way to grow and develop. And then it was, as you said, the Chinese consumer that everyone wanted to get access to. And would you give up technology to help get access to such a large market? How do you see some of these different countries seeing their role? Like, what's their aspiration at this point in terms of their own development and place in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think those countries, some of them, of course, and what's really fundamentally changed, I think, are 2 points when if I were in Asia to sort of really think through this. One is the big part of the developed market, that world is getting older, right? It's actually flipping demographically, and we've never really experienced what's happening in Italy and Japan. We don't know what that's going to do. So how can you really bet on them, those countries, the West buying more of whatever X and Y you make? And secondly, there tend to be countries that are not inviting your sort of the population to come and the younger population to come to their countries and take on the jobs, right? That we're not seeing that labor mobility. Maybe like 100 years ago, where even Japanese immigrants would leave and work in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or show up in Hawaii on the shores of Hawaii. We're not seeing that, right? This kind of migratory moves. So I think that's something you have to reflect on. That okay, I guess what's consistent is the change, and this time though something we've never seen, which is the demographic one. The other one we've never seen or we're only aware of now, which is these countries, they have to think about their place in the world in this, what some people call the Anthropocene, right? Where we know that humans are changing literally, the geology and sort of the structure of the earth, right? Particularly the climate. So I feel that in some instances, there are going to be some countries that maybe realize that they'll be more a bit like Brazil. They have actually some of the key biomes of the world, and actually they are going to be very important to preserve and to protect, and people are going to recognize that, and hopefully they'll be rewarded for that, for their forbearance, and right, and sort of stopping sort of the logging when it comes to palm oil and things like that. And maybe that will happen. I hope it does happen. The other side of it is, there's a little bit of like, well, why should we change? Because if that's the model, why are we denying it? Now, what comes in between that is the possibility of leapfrog. Maybe that will be the thing most of these countries are already active only on mobile phones. You can't really find anybody, and they're buying stuff, sharing things and such. So maybe there's a possibility there to be. But I think fundamentally what's going to happen is they're all going to have to go through a period of low carbon development. So how does that work? Back to the energy transition, right? It's inevitable. They may come later, but that's what they have to work towards. And so I think those, that'll be something to watch. But the reality is that, in Asia, historically, the whole absolute poverty narrative has been really about China and India because the numbers. We sort of forgot about the number of people in Cambodia, or even more Indonesia, that we, still we need to lift out of poverty. And so we also have to be careful, too, that that's the part of the world, along with parts of Africa as well, Latin America, where, we talk about energy transition, but there's fundamentally about, over 1 billion people who have no access. So what are they going to have access to in terms of their energy needs? So, yeah, I do think it's a mixed bag. It's not sort of that post-colonial and then being the beneficiary of sort of the Cold War between the Soviet sphere and the American sphere, and sort of playing that and being non-aligned, and then sort of and then over time picking out what areas that you want to be part of someone's sort of extended global value chain. I think it's a different game because there's just different parameters now that you have to deal with. But the biggest one, I think, for in Asia is still a relationship with China, right? And a relationship with the US. Like, how does that work? In a perfect, for any Asian, they'd say, look, if the Chinese and Americans get along, good for everybody, good for business, good for everything, right? And so I remember there's a famous ambassador to Japan, former majority leader of the Senate named Mike Mansfield. In the 1970s, he would say, his quote was, for those who were like Japan watchers like me, the U.S. and Japan is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none. Nobody would think that's the case today, but that moment in time, it was a really big deal in the 70s, right? In the 80s. So today, where is that big is it Russia, China, as the media sort of wants us to think? That's probably the one. Is in some ways, if there is a way of a reconciliation between China and the U.S., could that be something? And we're still searching for what's that new. I don't think there's a roadmap, but we're still looking for where the compass points are, right?
Well, and you've also started something new for yourself as well, so this could be a good time to talk about that. You've recently taken on a new role as the executive director of the Villars Institute, which is aiming to accelerate the transition to net zero and improve the health of the planet. And I wanted to ask you, why this new chapter for you? Because I'm curious how much is driven by your own views of how the nature of the challenges that the world faces and the approaches we need to take have changed.
It's something that I look at primarily as from a perspective as a parent. I have two boys, and they're 12 and 14. And it sort of hit me one day is that we talk about all of these goals that we want to achieve for the benefit of the planet. Obviously, the first and foremost is Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, which I don't think we're going to get to. But there's the bigger, more existential planetary goal of, obviously keeping and controlling emissions by 2050 and getting to net zero emissions globally, which is things, right? And I reflected on that. I said, well, first principles, let's assume we have enlightened leaders that got us to that goal in 2015. We're really celebrating, but where are they today? And I realized they're today. There's a young generation. They're in high school, maybe going into university right now. They're the ones that, where are they right now? Well, they're in a place of probably more eco anxiety and then eco ambition. And we spoke about this, and what's missing is the sense of agency, right? And that's what led me to say, well, what could we do as an institute? And two things. We said, look, one is to be honest about the nature of the challenge. And all of these challenges are interdisciplinary. And the solutions, though, have to be intergenerational. And that's hard to get people's mind around, because most things we don't, when we approach it, are very, very often, it's very rare. Even I'm sitting here today at the University of Geneva, where my office is, and I'm a professor. You don't see, you're not really rewarded and encouraged to do interdisciplinary work per se. But there are, increasingly these problems are interdisciplinary, and we know that. Secondly, even when you address them, we speak about the future, but it's really not intergenerational, because in a way, there are a lot of things that we've done to only discover the next generation absolutely does not believe in the approach that we put into place. The classic one on the energy transition that I tell people all the time is, look what happened in Germany and nuclear energy today. I mean, they built these power plants, and there was a period when people protested them. And then there was, the really political and just a crass political decision by Chancellor Merkel to shut them down after the Fukushima tragedy in 2011, and sort of double down even on natural gas pipelines to Russia, even after the Crimean, invasion of Crimea by the Russians in 2014. And now what are we looking at? We're stuck at Germany burning more coal, right? That's where you ended up. And young people saying, what's going on with that? Why aren't we doing back to nuclear power? And it's funny, it's trending on social media as young people sort of figured out the math. You're going to need many ways to do this. And so I think it's smarter to already engage the next generation or multiple generations in some of these approaches to the transition, so that we don't go one step forward, two step back, and or have the politics catch us blindside us. So that's the thing that's what we're focused on. So the idea is at the Institute is, okay, number one, let's show everybody, explain how the system works. Once you have the system works, you can at least have some sense of how you might approach it and agency. Two, appreciate that you can't just deal with climate. It's also biodiversity and water. And at the end of the day, we're dealing with, the planet, and there's some clear systems that we have to address and can't do without. And lastly, whatever we do, we need to consider that this solution will only work if we got buy-in, not just across the various stakeholders of today, but we also have the encouragement and engagement of the next generation, because that's what it's going to take, right? Because we're 2023 and 2050. That's a couple of generations, in my opinion, to get there, right?
And when you noted that we often take steps that we think will be for the benefit of the next generation, only to discover that they did not want us to do that. That's spoken as a true parent, I think.
I kind of came to that too. It's funny, Dave, because there's scientists, it's one of my mentors was talking once about these National Academy of Science and Engineering in the US often do lists of great, engineering feats of one century. And then, next year they talk about the big challenges. And often you can draw a connection that some of the greatest things, like the discovery and use of plastics, which people forget. I mean, it is important, and you think about what's happened in so many industries, including the medical industry. But then we have this whole narrative about plastic garbage patch in the ocean and ingesting microplastics. Take civil aviation, great, but now today it's still the really hard part of in the transportation sector to reduce emissions. Right, they're really difficult. So take a technology. Often we're just going to find, and I guess that's also what's concerning people around the debates around. For example, artificial intelligence and the like. But there's something to that, right? And I guess the key for us is how do we exercise an approach that it's not about foresight, it's about being a trustee for the future. So really sort of measure twice, cut once kind of approach to some of these things.
And I've realized in talking with you today, there seems to be a thread throughout your career of this focus on fostering collaboration, and that continues with your work at the Villars Institute now, collaboration between nations, collaboration between generations, collaboration between academic disciplines and approaches to working on problems. So I was hoping maybe as we wrap up today, you could share with us, maybe your perspective, some lessons on what can we be doing to try to approach these big global challenges in a more collaborative way, a more peaceful way, given your own experience?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned is the people that are good at this, and I'm not claiming to be because I'm new and I'm trying to study and understand this though, are people who are smart, but where they're exceptional is not necessarily in terms of measuring their IQ, but it's their EQ, right? Because what we realized in terms of systemic change, to accelerate it, you have to work at a human scale. It's about trust and coordinating and basically not having actual authority to do things. So you have to convince others to go along. You recognize that what you're dealing with is really building narratives where people feel that they have agency to sort of complete the story, right? Narratives are open-ended and they're sort of inviting the stakeholders to come along and really shape that future. Those are all skills in a way that, traditional management training and others, it never really recognized or emphasized, right? I mean, it's been always about control and stability of a process and sort of in-depth knowledge about the subject matter, the technical matter. But in reality, these are all complex issues because we're learning from other disciplines like behavioral science that we're complex. We're not rational. And, look, I can point, anybody can point to, we can go back. I won't get into the op-ed space, but like what's happening in the United States in terms of some of the politics and happening in the House doesn't seem rational, or some of the reactions to some of the policies in the past related to public health and, vaccines, it doesn't seem rational, but, we can't wish that away. That's the nature. But that means we need people to who understand people, who can bring people around different views. But I think the key in collaboration that I've observed is articulating what your common values are. You may not have common approaches, but we can, I think, agree that there's only one planet and we all have to do our best to sort of operate and prosper within what scientists have identified as these 9 planetary boundaries. If we can agree on that, then, and we have, by the way, because that's how we addressed the issue of the ozone layer's depletion in the 1980s, when every country in the world signed the Montreal Protocol. Every country that existed at the time did. And we've managed to heal and repair that, part of the atmosphere. So it's doable. Of course it is. But at the same time, it makes us have to kind of reconsider our own approaches to leadership, and also our willingness to also exercise followership and say, look, maybe in this one I'm co-pilot, or maybe I'm in the back seat, because that's the only way to get things, moving, right?
Thanks again to Lee Howell, Executive Director at the Villars Institute. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Join us next week as we continue our series, Commodities in Asia, with Heye Yang, founder and CEO of LNG Easy. We'll be discussing the role of LNG in Asia and how it differs from the role of natural gas in the US and Europe. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets, facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.